Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 53 of the Bill podcast, and in this episode we'll be going through command line applications and how we can create such an app using Node and Ruby. For the purpose of this episode, we'll be using two libraries or packages, Commander for Node and Thor for Ruby. So before we dive into this week's episode on command line apps, do check out some of the episodes that will be required because of the previous knowledge. First one is definitely terminal, because it is command line application will be working a lot with the terminal. The second one will be package manager. For this episode, we will be using npm and Ruby gems to kind of download the Node and Ruby related packages. Next up is definitely bash, and in this bash episode I have actually also gone through shell scripting, which is using a bash, and in this episode we'll be similarly using Node and Ruby just to get a little bit of perspective on how shell scripting or command line apps are done using other languages. And lastly, definitely Node. We will not be touching very advanced Node, but I guess this episode will give you a little bit brief introduction about what is Node. Alright, so let's get into why command line apps. And I felt this slide share or slides gave a very brief introduction to what is the usefulness of creating a command line app. So let's go through some of them. We definitely work a lot with devices and browsers, but command line apps are definitely a life of a developer. For example, SSH, MySQL, Linux, even Rails, Ruby, we use command line a lot of the time. And so far, some of the common languages that we used are Bash, ZSH, or PowerShell. And I believe this author of the slides also explains it really well, that hey, a command line app is lightweight. It is also scriptable, which means you can automate a task, whether it is a one-time task or whether it is a repeatable task. And lastly, it also has a consistent UX across all platforms. Do definitely check out this slide share by Nikhil Mangal. And let's go ahead and check out the two applications or libraries that we'll be using. The first up is Commander.js, which will be based on Node. And this will allow us to create very easy command line applications. Do check out the GitHub repository on Commander.js, and definitely check out the examples folder, because it is using Commander to build little applications, just snippets of code for us to get started with Commander. The second one that we'll be exploring is Thor, which is based on Ruby. In fact, Thor is being used by a lot of other very important Ruby gems. For example, Bundler, Vagrant, Rails, and many, many more. And definitely check out the GitHub repository for Thor as well. Great, so let's get started with our command line application. So here I am in my desktop in a completely empty folder called Command Line Apps. So let's go through very briefly some commands that we already use, some little command line applications. For example, Git is a very big command line application, and when you press Git, you will already have some help commands on usage and some of the subcommands used by Git. But Git also comes with, for example, options. So you might want to do git commit, which is a subcommand, and then -a, -m, and then some message, for example, initial commit, and so on and so forth. Similarly, you also have things like SSH, another common command, or even npm. So do ensure you have npm installed. And once you click npm, it will also give us a little help command. So these are some examples of command line applications we already use in our daily life. Why don't we create a very simple one? So we are in an empty folder. Why don't we create a file called, let's say, myinfo. So now we have just one file. Let me open this up in Sublime Text. Now the very first thing we want to do is to make this file an executable. So why don't we check its permissions first? So when you check its permission, you will realize that for the current user, you have read permission, you have write permission, but then you have a tiny hyphen, which kind of denotes that you cannot execute it. So this is the first thing we need to do. Let's go ahead and change it with chmod u+x to note that add the executing rights. And then we will just pass in the file name. And once again, when we check, we will see that, hey, this little X is added, which means to say you can execute this file. And of course, I also have this color of the file a little different. Great, so now that the file is an executable, let's start coding in it. Now the very first line we want to add at the top of this script is the fact that which program to load, and we do that using a shebang syntax, and then we will pass in the path to the program. For our case, this will be simply bash. Now if we go to the Wikipedia page on shebang, it will give us a brief outline on where and how shebang is used. Of course, it's called in a various way. And interestingly, you can also execute other programming languages such as PHP, Python, Ruby, or even Bash that we are using. And later on, we will see how we can use it with Ruby and Node. So do go ahead and give a brief read through this page on shebang. Now what we want to do in this script is really simple. Why don't we echo out to the user? And there you go, the user is there. And secondly, we can also kind of list out all the files and folders. So these are the two actions we will do. And very simply, we will just put in the same code that we executed in the command line into this file. Because hey, we do not want to execute this echo user and ls-al every single time. Why don't we just script it up into a file called myinfo? Great, so now that this is executable and we do have something inside, why don't we just run this file? And there you go, you have the username here, and then you also have the information for ls-al. But here's the thing, let's open up a new tab and let's try to execute myinfo again. And immediately you'll see that command not found. Well, why is this so? Now, because we did have myinfo, the file, into this folder, so when we executed myinfo, we could kind of display the user and the ls-al info. But the moment we go to another folder, obviously it cannot find the file. So how do we deal with this? Well, the very first thing we need to do is to kind of make a symlink. This is what I like to do. Make this symlink in a folder that is found in our profile file. So let's open up this profile file. Now for me it is .zshrc. For you it might be .bashrc or .profile. So anything, and for me I like to keep everything, all the scripts, this kind of automated scripts, into this path which is found on the home directory /sites/scripts. So just pick a path or add a path to your profile, whatever you prefer, and the next thing we will do is create a symlink. So there you see, this is my folder which is /sites/scripts, and I'm going to create a symlink here. So to create a symlink, it will be ln-s, and let's first go to the original script location, and that'll be under desktop, command line apps, and then myinfo. And then we will basically link it to the folder right here. And of course, in the end, we will put in the same file name. Now notice what happens when we do this. When we come back to the Finder, you will see that a symlink has been created. Now it means that since the path is found in the profile, now wherever we execute myinfo, no matter which folder, it will be able to give us the information. Why don't we try it? So let's say myinfo. Great. Why don't we go to the home directory and let's do myinfo, which will be huge. It seems like with just the change in the permission, as well as doing a little symlink, we are able to execute this little script anywhere. So that was a little bit about how we usually create scripts with Bash. But now we will learn how to do it with, let's say, Ruby first. And to do it with Ruby, we will install Thor. So let me come back to my folder, which only has one file. The very first thing we need to do is ensure that Thor is installed. So you just do gem install Thor. Now I have already done that, and then you can just query the Thor version, and I'm using 0.18.1. And of course the other command that is very, very helpful is Thor help. Now it is very important to also observe how other command line applications such as gem or Thor actually executes. You notice here it is very, very intuitive, like Thor version will give us the version, Thor help will give us command help. And let's see what happens when you do Thor itself. it will also give us some instructions on how to use Thor. So let's say somebody who comes new to Thor will know exactly how to use it. So let me just create a directory called Thor here, and let me cd inside Thor. And over here, let's create a very simple file called app. So let me come back to my Sublime Text, and the very first thing I will do in the app is to write the shebang, so which is pound and exclamation mark /usr /bin/env, basically the path to where Ruby resides. So for me it is this. Now the next thing we will do is to change the permissions for this app, because right now it is not executable. So very similarly to what we did before, we will just do chmod ux u+x, and now it is unexecutable. If you notice the difference between bash file and this app, here we can code in bash, and guess what? Here you can code in something very familiar to you, which is Ruby. So let's start coding. So the very first thing we will do is require Thor. And let's just create a class and let's call it app, which is under Thor. Great. So now under class, let's have the very first command, and we will call it simply as start. And what start will do, it will just say, hey, started. And this should be capital T. Great. So now let's come back to the command line and execute this file. So it says that attempted to create command start, but without a description. So why don't we add in a description? So to add in a description just before the method start, we will add in a desc keyword and then say start. And we will basically put a description, so say start project. And the final thing we need to do is just say app.start using all the arguments. Great, so let's come back to our command line, and this time let's just key in app. And using Thor, you'll immediately see that there'll be a little description of what the commands to use. Similarly, you can go ahead and say app help. It will also give us the commands, and more importantly, app start, which is the one that we created, and this should give us a little started out. So with a simple boilerplate as this, let's move on, and this time let's pass in an argument. So why don't we pass in our name here, and as part of the output we will also display it like this. So instead of just saying app start, we will also pass in the project name, let's say travel, and it will say, hey, started travel. Or we can also say to-do list, and it will say started to-do list. Similarly, you can also pass in other arguments. So for example, apart from name, let's say you also want to pass in author, and you can also put in, say, by and then the author name. But you can also put in some defaults. So you can say that, hey, by default it can be nil, and you put in the author name only if author is passed. Great, so why don't we try this out? So of course, before we do that, we need to change the description as well. So you say start name and then say start a project with a name. Great, so let's try this out. So in our command line, we can pass in the project name and the author, and there you go, you will see by author. Or if you do not pass in the author, you will just have started the project. Great, so why don't we put in another argument? So let's say this time is a deadline, and let's say we'll say authored by, and we will add in another line to say to be completed by deadline. First we have the project name, and then we have, say, the deadline. Let's just put it October, and then the author's name, and immediately you will see the 3 output. But this is becoming a little too cumbersome, isn't it? Because we do not know each of the arguments refer to what. So for this case, you can pass in options. So for example, instead of passing in author as an argument, we can start it off with an option and then say author. And over here, we will basically have to say, hey, this is author as an option. And we can similarly say if it is part of options. So it should be options. All right, great. So let's try this out in our command line. So this time what we will do is, yes, the project name, the deadline, and we can pass in the author name as an option, author. Great, the author line comes out, but you can also choose to remove author. And in this case, only the project name and the deadline will appear. And as a final note in Thor, we will learn how to put in other options with type of options. So the very first one, let's just put in multi-user, and this type, instead of being just a string, it will be simply Boolean, and it will just output it will be multi-user only if the options is multi-user. So why don't we try it out? So now we will pass in, say, multi-user as false, and there you go, the line that it will be multi-user is not output. But now if we do true, we will have 4 lines with the last one being, we'll have 4 lines with the last one being, hey, it will be a multi-user. Now, of course, for the purpose of simplicity, I'm only just outputting out some strings, but with the use of, say, other Ruby gems, we can make this command line application much, much more powerful. The good thing about Thor is these things about putting in options and putting in description, or even the simple help command, putting in arguments, defaults, comes in really, really handy. They are already baked in for you. So now the very next thing we will do is Commander using Node.js. So let's create a new folder, and I'll just call it Commander. And inside Commander, I will create a new file called start. And just like previously, I will start off with the shebang, and I will basically put in the path to the program. And for me, it is simply node. In the command line, let me also just get inside the folder, and I will also change the permission of the file start. And I will also create a simple Symlink. The original file is obviously residing in a slightly different folder path. And now when I view my scripts folder, I have the previously done app, my info, and finally start. Great, so now we can basically type in JavaScript here. So even without requiring the commander npm, the node package module npm, let's just simply do console log hello. And let's just simply do start. And there you go, you'll have a very simple command line hello. So next on, let's just install the commander, and we can do a global install of commander. Now I have already done that. And if you have done that as well, if you query the version, I'm using 4.1.5, and similarly, you can also query help. And this will basically give us some of the options and the commands. Right, so very similar to Thor, the very first thing we will do is require this commander module. So var program equals to require, and we'll do commander. Now notice here, even before we did anything, if we just do start, obviously there will be a console log, but if you do start help, it will basically not be very useful. And these are the very first 2 things that a new user does. Or even for our own use, if we come back to it 6 months later, if we do help and version, there'll be no information about this. So Commander and Thor makes it very, very useful. So the very first thing we'll do is program dot. We will basically pass in the version. So for us, let's just say 0.1. And we will also pass in the various arguments. Process.argv. Great, so with this little statement, now if we query say help, there you go, it will give us the options that we have. And we can also query version, and it will give us a simple version. And of course, if we just simply say start, it will just give us hello. So why don't we start with passing in some options? So the very first thing we'll do, let's pass in an option, and we'll do it with a dot option. And let's give it the short form. Let's say -t, comma, or you can also pass in --html, and you can pass in, say, the file name, and let's give it a description, say add HTML file. And you can also pass in a default. So you can pass in, say, hey, by default, it should be index.html. Why don't we pass in a second option? So this one will be -c, or you can also pass in --css, you can say file, and just give it a little bit of explanation. Hey, add CSS file. So just for simplicity, instead of console.log just hello, why don't we say created HTML file? And then simply, if we want to basically output whatever the user has input, we can do program.html, and this HTML is basically coming in from the option name. And I'm just going to copy the same thing and say created CSS file, and this time it will be program.css. Great, so why don't we try this out? So in our command line, instead of saying simply start, we will say --html index.html, and we'll say --css style.css. And there you go, it will console log index.html and style.css. Obviously, we did not create the file. But here's the thing, if you do simply start, notice here, HTML file will give us index.html because it is default. We have notified here it is default. But if there is no default, it will be undefined. Can we give it something helpful? So if some kind of error checking. So in Commander, we can basically check the arguments. So in this case, we will check the length of arguments. If it is lesser than 3, we will just basically output the help, the entire help screen. Great, so let's try this out. Now if I just say start, guess what? It will give us all the options, kind of hinting to us, hey, you know, you can use these options. And simply, if you just do index.html, style.css, it will output this. Very simply, you can start creating a very powerful command line application. Alright, so we saw how we can execute the start command with some options. How about some sub commands? So let's say we want to have start and then serve, and maybe it will open up some website. And how about we will execute some shell commands? So for this, we will require another module and call it child process exec. And after requiring it, let's create a brand new subcommand. And let me start program.command. And let's pass in the command name. We will simply call it serve. Let's also add in a description. Say open the project in the browser. And what will be the action? Let's pass in an anonymous function. And here we will basically execute a shell command. So why don't we just say open build-podcast.com, and maybe a console log as well. Opened project. Great. And finally, we will just say program.parse, just to make it a bit more readable. Great, so let's come back to our terminal, and this time we will simply say start and then serve. And there you go, it will automatically open up the website in the browser. And in the command line, notice here it will say, hey, open project. But guess what is happening here? It is still console logging created HTML and CSS. Obviously, we only want this only if program.css exists. So I'm just going to pass all of this inside this little check. Let's try this out one more time. Start serve and opens the browser. Great. So why don't we now go ahead and really create this file? And this is the power of using, say, a programming language such as Node and Ruby. You're already familiar with file processing or many other modules and packages that you can use in to create this command line app. So let me go ahead and create a new folder. Let's call it template. And inside this template, we will have a new file. The first one will be HTML, and it will be really simple. Let's change the syntax, add in the title, my new web project. Let's add in a header 1, hi there, and a header 2. But we also want to kind of link the style sheet. So over here, the reference to the style sheet will depend on the user input. So why don't we put in some sort of a variable that we can replace? So I'll just put in like this templating language and then include style sheet here. Next, let's briefly create a new file and call it _CSS. And this will be really simple, just a background color to indicate, hey, the style sheet has been linked correctly. So I'll just give it a CSS color name called wheat. Now with these two templates created, now we will do a little bit of file manipulation. So why don't we require the module and call it fs so that it can do all sorts of file manipulation. Now the very first thing we will do is probably create a variable called template path. Of course, this template path will depend on the command line application you're creating. It can be a relative path, but for simplicity, I'll just put in the desktop commander and then template. Now only if the user inputs CSS that we will go ahead and actually create the HTML and CSS file. So let me first go ahead and copy the template. So for this, I'll execute the shell command once again, and I'll basically copy it from the template path. Firstly, I'll copy the CSS file, and this CSS file will be actually called the same as the user input. Next up, I will go ahead and also create the HTML file. So let me copy it from the template. And of course, it is underscore HTML. And it will also be in the same name as the user input, which will be program.html. And finally, we will basically pass in an anonymous function for a little bit of error checking and also callback. So if there's an error, it will just display the error. Else, why don't we say created HTML and CSS files? Great, so why don't we try this out? Is it really creating the extra files here? So let me clear the command line, and this time I'll pass in HTML and CSS. Oops, looks like there is an error. Yes, there's an extra tilde here. So let me try to execute it one more time. So looks like there is an error in the copy. There should be a little space right here, which I'm missing. Let's execute it one more time. And looks like there's no error. And when we come back to our Sublime Text text editor, and there you go, the new style.css and index.html have been created. Why don't we delete this? Let me create it with slightly different names, say app.html and app.css. And guess what? We have two new files, app.css and app.html. Great. Now, obviously, the next thing we want to do is replace this little thing with the style sheet name that the user inputs. And for this case, it will be app.css. So for this, let's go ahead and read the file. So we'll do read file. And we'll basically read in the same file, program.html. And we will just pass in the format and basically read in the data. And of course, I'll do some error checking. And let's just do some replacement of the files. So basically, it will do data.replace. Let's use a little bit of regular expression. So for us, it's really simple. It's just style sheet. And what do we replace it with? The user input for program.css. And maybe we can say style sheet is linked. Great. So now when we try out in our new file index.html, the style sheet should be replaced. So I have a little error. Oops, I shouldn't be closing the bracket here. Let's run it one more time. Style sheet is linked. And now when we come back and view index.html, it is still there. That's because we need to read and then write it to the file. So for this, let's write to the file. So write file. And of course, the file name is program.html. Let's write in the new data, which is the replace data with a certain format. And let's pass in an anonymous function with the error code. And over here, let's just pass in simply new files with link styles are created. So let's run this command one more time. And now when we come back to index.html, guess what? It is style.css. So just for the sake of demo, I'm just going to delete these two files. And maybe this time we can just do app.html and app.css. Come back, you have app.html. Guess what? It is linked to app.css. Now, as a final note, it will be cool if we can actually open up this project instead of a random URL. So for this, why don't we execute some shell commands? And I will start up a very simple Python server, and that is simply simple HTTP server 8000. And after it starts the server, I will basically say, hey, open up localhost. And maybe a simple statement to say, hey, simple HTTP server is running, and I should close the white space here. And finally, we can say view the project at HTTP localhost port 8000. Now for this, because it is running in the folder, it will automatically only run index.html instead of app.html. So let me go ahead and delete any other created HTML files or CSS files. So let me go ahead and create index.html and style.css. And yep, it's created. Come back, check, looks good. Why don't we try out start and then serve? Looks like it is working. And there you go, the new web project has started. Obviously, the style sheet is linked. When we come to the terminal, it is also a continuous process to see that the server is running. A very simple web project. Now, as a final note, just to kind of enhance our command line application, let me delete away the previous files once again. I also like to have colored output in the terminal. So notice here all these are black. You tend to get a little bit mixed up with the important messages. So why don't we require a new NPM, and that is called CLC that I like to use. So let's require CLI-color. So just as an example, how can we use this? So instead of just plain console log, we can just do CLC.thecolor. So in this case, we can do red. And let's close the bracket. Shall we try start serve once again? And when you do this, guess what? It is happening in red color. Of course, we did not create the project. That's why it opened up in an empty one. So in order to create the project here, why don't we come right at the bottom? So new files created. Why don't we try clc.blue and close up the bracket? So let's try it. Start HTML, CSS, new files created, and start serve. There you go. The new project has been created. A very simple command line application. But I hope using Thor and Commander, it has given you a very brief overview on how we can extend it. And to end off the episode, let me go through some related links. There's a fantastic Tuts Plus course on command line apps in Ruby by Jose Mota. And he goes through both Thor and GLI and even some extras like how to do testing, coloring, interactivity. There is also a fantastic book called Command Line Apps in Ruby. Do buy it from Pragmatic Programmers. And also a talk by the author, Dave Copeland, who also speaks about how to build command line applications. I also found this blog post by Liangton very useful in writing CLI apps in Node.js. He gives a lot of examples of other libraries and modules as well. Also do check out this blog post on building with Thor. This author also gives many examples of other command line applications and also why and how you can choose such a CLI. Great, and for the build link of the episode, it goes to Web Tools Weekly. This is curated by Lewis. And what I like is it's also found in RSS, which is added to my RSS, and I get a weekly dose of new tools to try out. So do go ahead and subscribe either by email or RSS to webtoolsweekly.com. And that's it for this week's episode of Build Podcast. For all other episodes of Build Podcast, you can just go ahead and search and look it up in the website, or subscribe via the 6 channels: RSS, iTunes, Vimeo, YouTube, GitHub, or Twitter. And I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.